Episode 73, 18th Century Hogs, the Start of the Pork Industry. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the domestication and rise of the market for North American colonial pigs. The terrifying swine were about, but hunted like any other game. The farm pigs, now they were going through changes as pork consumption on land and on the sea was on the rise. To learn about how things looked in the pig pens, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that pork, not beef, was the most common meat of the 18th century colonies. And this was a bit of a shock for the visitors from England. In fact, it was so common that rich people were starting to get picky about what part of the pigs they would even eat. And that's another thing. Swine at this point came by many names. Unlike now, a pig was not a pig was not a pig. First, there were the wild hogs that, quote, swarm like vermin upon the earth, unquote. These were hunted and preferred for dry curing. Their lower fat content due to their active foraging lifestyle and their diet of forest fruits and nuts and bugs. We can't pretend that they didn't eat a lot of bugs and worms and grubs. So that diet and their lower fatness made them easier to dry cure and also gave them a flavor that became famous at home and abroad. Pigs specifically meant little piggies, often roasted whole, and they could be handled by a single cook. Then there were the shoots or shoats, and these were slightly larger pigs under around 50 pounds that were often quartered and divided between different consumers. Barrows or sows were used for breeding and only dispatched when they were old. For a farm pig. But they were large, and this was only done in cold weather when all the preservation tasks could get done before the meat turned. Then there were the rest of the adult pigs, and they were generally separated into bacon hogs and porkers. The bacon hog was mostly salted and smoked and dried, or made into bacon and hams, while the porker was mostly destined to either be fresh or barreled salt pork. In the 17th century, if you remember, everyone had a pig or so, more or less. And as the villages and towns formed, the wandering pigs in the streets were a problem. Sure, they might eat up the garbage in the streets and the dooryards, but they also created their own leavings and on more than one occasion threatened or attacked a wandering toddler. So by the time we get to the 18th century and actual cities have formed, pigs are starting to be excluded from them. They need to either be kept in pens on farms or run about in forests away from civilization where they can be rounded up later when it's time. The period of the village pig in the streets is basically over. And with that, pork takes its place alongside cod and wood as another of the early successful industries of the North American colonies. Instead of each homestead having its own pig or a couple of pigs, we get the first real pig farms. And with pig farms being out of town, we also get butchers. Butchers then as now would purchase their own meat animals and break them down and sell pieces to the public. But another important service they would provide is breaking down animals you brought to them. Then as now, hunters of a certain type would certainly bring deer to the butcher and have it broken down some, or even rather extensively. But they would also bring in slaughtered shoats or hogs, along with veal and other varieties of beef, and a few antiquated sheep. This wasn't laziness on the part of the customer either. Butchers were the ones with the right tools, the right knives and saws and hatchets and such, but also the knowledge. The right cuts could be turned into the right products, and bad cuts could foul up all the understood preserving techniques of the time. Now, breaking down a large hog in the 18th century was rather an art. Even on the very outside, there were items of value. Hog bristles. These are the coarse hairs all over the bodies of nearly every swine out there. They would be shaved off and then used for brushes of many kinds. Paintbrushes, hairbrushes, and for the new fashionable brush, the toothbrush. Tooth sticks and roots with frayed ends have had starring roles in tooth health on and off here and there in different societies as ways of freshening the breath and cleaning out food bits. But with the rise of sugar and the alarming spread of tooth rot in its wake, new intensified interest in tooth hygiene grew in the 18th century. While anyone can wake up with a fuzzy-feeling mouth from not brushing before bed, The increased use of sugar created a new sticky plaque coating in people's mouths that had been largely unknown. The bacteria that live in our mouths are little parasites, living off carbohydrate fragments that don't make it down our throats and into our bellies. Sure, not great, but chewing on a licorice root and drinking some water would keep their waste products of acids down to a minimum, and the result is, sure, some tooth problems, but things were not terribly bad. But our new food BFF, sugar, whether crystallized or in its syrup forms like molasses or maple or honey, that supercharges the bacteria that lives in our mouth, and they start to make a tooth-coating sticky film when there are so many of them. And all their waste acids that they're producing really can go to town on tooth enamel. Next thing you know, tooth decay and the infections associated with it become a somewhat common cause of death. So now, there is heightened interest in tooth cleaning tools as well. Chewing on roots and sticks is all very good and has a dignified history and long pedigree. Evidence of the practice shows up over and over all over the world, including depictions in Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and even medieval European records. But here in the 18th century, the advanced metallurgy of the age has resulted in finer drills. Remember when I spoke of marquetry and other fine woodwork that was making its way into Europe back at the beginning of the season? Well, those same drills made for the creation of toothbrushes, and a favorite material for the toothbrushes were hog bristles. Also horsehair, especially the coarse hairs from the tails and the manes. Anyway, a piece of bone or ivory could be made into a toothbrush shape, and a head would have holes drilled into its top. Then 2 or 3 channels would be drilled perpendicular to those holes, and a copper wire could be strung into the channels, pulled up in loops through the holes, and then tufts of bristles could be anchored by this loop of wire as it was pulled back down into the hole. There are lots of varieties on this. In fact, a silver toothbrush handle has been found in colonial Williamsburg dating to the end of the 18th century. In this way, a toothbrush once carved could be repeatedly re-bristled as needed. And these brushes were used with a variety of tooth powders, but I won't get into that until those are marketed to more of the American public, and cardboard makes the whole marketing thing much more common in American society. But I will say right now, it is going to be a long time before the idea of minty fresh makes its way into tooth cleaning. Okay. After the pig bristles, there's the skin, also known as the rind. Pig skin, of course, could become leather, but frankly, that is a use that only really becomes popular starting in the late 19th century. At this point, there's plenty of deer hide and cowhide for leather, and besides, cracklins, or fried pig skin, with crunchy fat attached to it, is faster to make, and face it, way more fun to eat. Making these different versions of pork rinds is why pigs are scalded in boiling or very nearly boiling water to get that outside layer off, the one in contact with the outside world and that had all the bristles in it. The feet and tail are removed. The feet and tail are bony and full of collagen. These are alternately smoked and dried to use them to flavor vegetable items, greens and beans especially, or pickled in brine or vinegar solutions. This makes them soft and easier to dismantle, and they are eaten for tasty bits of meat, sort of a snack that's its own entertainment. Now the head is actually full of meat, to the point where the skull and lower jaw are often separated. Hog jowls are a store of prized tasty fat. The Italian item guanciale is basically pork cheek bacon, but these pockets of fat can also show up sliced and fried or in fresh pork puddings as well. The top of the head is traditionally boiled for a good long time and then left to cool in the rich broth it produces. All the collagen ends up as gelatin, and the meat of the head is shredded into it. The combination of shredded head meat, cooked down in the ever-thickening gelatin, is where we end up with head cheese, also known as souse meat. This would be spiced according to an individual cook's taste. It was actually a rare fast food that could keep in a cold pantry when it was made during the chilly part of the year, which was hog killing time. It could be then sliced and served with bread. The fancy version of this would be known as terrine, See, even then, French names were beginning to gain currency in English cookery by the late 18th century. But to most other people, it was just cheese. Head cheese is going to be one of those things we lose to the yuck factor, mainly because something that was carefully made gets industrialized, and frankly, the national palate will simply change for both these flavors and textures, much the same way we lost interest in the original version of syllabub. Oh, and the brain. In the fat-starved 18th century colonies, the pig brain was a fatty treat. Either beaten into sauces or breaded and fried as fritters, this was a popular treat. However, as one of the variety meats of the freshly killed pig, this is an item that wasn't included in many cookery books. Not because it wasn't popular, because it was. But instead, no one really needed a recipe for it. The brain appeared, and any cook worth their sea salt simply knew what to do. Why waste time writing down what everybody knows? The neck was the source of either steaks, cut across the vertebra, or cut up for sausage meat. The backbone or chine was extracted. It was usually boiled as part of making the pork stock or strong broths that would be used for sauces in preserving collared parts of the pig. And finally, we get to the big cuts, the hams and the loins. These were the best parts for drying and salting and smoking. The whole muscles worked best because they kept together and they picked up a pickle or a salting rub, and then they dried well in a sensible way. However, if you were well off or throwing a medium-sized party, whole pigs were for big parties, roasting a large muscle of pork over a fire and then adding a crisp crust at the end was the mark of a good cook and would make the center dish of a celebration. In smaller and lower quality pigs, there are also the parts that would be roughly chopped into about 5-pound hunks and then placed in a strong brine to make salt pork. And this would be the majority food of the soldier, the sailor, the explorer, the trailblazer, the fur-trapping voyageur, the fisherman, and the whaler. In fact, just about anyone who is not a farmer anywhere in the colonies for those times that they did eat meat. And even the farmers, in the hungry springtime and the hot summer, when killing an animal was nonsensical, even for them, salted or pickled pork would be the meat most often turned to. The inside of the pig, the livers, the lungs, and some of the other organs would usually end up in sausage. And that would mean all the scrappy bits trimmed off the bones as the larger cuts were removed. Sometimes the ribs could be cooked and eaten on their own, but more often the meat would simply be stripped off the bone and added to the sausage pile. To make the sausage really happen, there are 3 other items that had to come along. There's the caul or lace fat, the stomach, and then the chitterlings and the guts. The caul or lace fat is a protective wrap around some of the organs. In English and French cookery, this was used, among other things, to wrap around balls of sausage meat to contain them as they cooked and also add a little more fat. The stomach was often stuffed with some sort of spice sausage type mixed, and then it would be boiled. So generally, this was a fresh sausage meant to be eaten soon after or as part of the hog killing event. The chitterlings, the small intestines, and the guts, the larger intestines, would be well cleaned out and then stuffed with sausage mixture and then preserved in a variety of ways. The English-style cookery of the day was the main influence in 18th century sausage making. As a result, there were black sausages or puddings, those that contained blood, and then white sausages or puddings, those without blood. They tended to be thickened or bound with grains like oats or cornmeal, and later as bread became more common, breadcrumbs showed up in recipes. The main spices were sage and salt. The red pepper pods or black peppercorns might appear as well, along with mace if you were kinda rich. Colonial sausage tended to be leaner, 2 to 4 parts meat to 1 part fat in the very early part of the century. Though as pigs got fatter and more beef fat was to be had, the fat proportion would rise even to 1-to-1, or even 1 part lean to 2 parts fat. Though these super fat sausages were often to be stored for a long time and were made with the harder fats that kept better. The leaner sausages were usually preserved by a combination of salting, smoking, and air drying, and in homes, smokehouses would take on the stereotypical look with the sausages hanging from the rafters. Sausages that were only for short keeping would be boiled in thick broth, that souse made from the feet and heads and backbone and such, and then left to cool and harden. Then the sausages would be pulled out of the thick gelatiny broth that had been defending them from the air, and they would get fried up. Now, pigs have 3 distinct types of commonly separable fat. This doesn't include the intramuscular fat that you sort of find marbling some cuts of modern pigs. 18th century pigs were typically leaner and didn't have a lot of that fat. So this is the kind of fats they did have. And the different uses of the different fats in our food animals is going to have lots of repercussions going forward. We'll see it especially in bison with pemmican, cows in lots of ways, and in whales over and over and over. But let's look at pigs right now since that's where we are. The fats we most think about with pigs is the subcutaneous fat, the stuff under the skin, lard. This is most of the fat a pig has, and so logically where our minds go when we are thinking about pig fat. It's the layer outside of the muscles and what is attached to the skin when cracklings are made. It is also the fat that is mostly used for deep fat frying that is starting to evolve in the colonies as the hogs get fatter. Initially reserved for the fancy frying of dessert dainties, as lard becomes easier to access, more and more fried food shows up on the colonial table. By the second half of the century, there's fried sausages, fritters, and fried fish. Pottery jars of rendered lard became a common sight in pantries all up and down the social classes. The second fat is a fat lost to our modern world, and that's the belly fat. In many an animal, this was often likened to butter. It was usually made up of the most complicated fatty acids, and so was the softest. However, because it was also mostly unsaturated, it was the stuff that's going to go rancid the quickest. As a result, the items that would be made with this soft belly fat were often specialty things that were treats associated with the task of butchering. But melting that fat and scooping it up with these newfangled beaten and even the fluffy biscuits that were emerging in the 18th century was definitely seen as a butchering time treat. Now, the most coveted fat was the leaf lard. It was called this because in a cold pig, flakes of this lard can be picked out of the interior cavity of the pig and almost stored as is. This hard fat is saturated. That means the fatty acids all line up nicely, and so the fat easily solidifies or gets short. And this hard fat is also what was used in making pastry. In the parts of the year when butter was running out or had gone bad, the leaf lard would fill in to create flaky crusts, and the puff pastries needed to deck out a fine table. This hard leaf lard, because it is a saturated fat, all the oxygens in the chains of the fatty acids have super stable bonds to hydrogens, and so it stayed good for a very long time, especially if it was rendered or tried out to a sort of tallow or purified. And it wasn't just useful for making pastry. It would also work well as the top of potted meats or to plug the necks of jars keeping pickles and other preserves. And in a pinch, it could even be added to the store of fats being used to make tallow candles. Now, there are 2 particularly unique pig things that were coming out of the colonies, and mostly out of Virginia. Around the big cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Newport, there were definitely growing pig industries. But those pigs were often consuming the food garbage of these same cities as a decent part of their feed. The growing cider and beer breweries, the scraps from different food growing industries, rotten milk, bad flour, and quite frankly, the collected scraps from taverns and so on. Cities didn't want a lot of food waste stinking up the town any more than other things were already stinking up their towns, and the pig farmers loved a cheap source of food. The only problem is that feeding pigs garbage makes them more likely to pick up and carry interesting worms and infections. This also means that the pigs aren't as tasty as they could be, and their meat and organs are rather suspect. As a result, in this age and on into modern times, pork always was cooked extremely thoroughly if anyone had any sense about anything. Thus, boiling things for 2 or 3 or even 5 hours if the hunk of meat was rather large was simply common sense. Cooking sausages thoroughly, then smoking or drying them, and then boiling or frying them at the end of all this is just how it went. Everyone knew incorrectly and incompletely cooked pork made people sick. So pork absolutely had to have the ever-living Dickens cooked out of it. Of course, letting it hang out in a strong salt brine was a viable solution as well. But of course, you had to soak and then boil that pork to make it edible again, and then cook it some way to get it to its final form. But down in Virginia, there were lots of woods, and particularly hardwoods, oaks and chestnuts and walnuts and such. These produce acorns and, well, nuts, which pigs absolutely love. The Virginia forest foraging pig had a much nicer diet and life than his near-city brethren. These pigs would go out into the forest much like the German and Spanish pigs of Roman times. Westphalia, or German hams, had a reputation of excellence for over 1,000-ish years by the time our colonists came over. So did the Spanish hams, but remember, the English hated the Spanish then, so had no time for their food, even their excellent hams. So the cookbooks are littered with ways to make imitation Westphalian hams. Of course, what the colonists came to realize is that if you feed your swine tasty forest nuts and fruits, their meat in general, and hams in particular, will come out great. So better pig keeping makes better pig meat is the first revelation. The second is the practice of dry salting. In England at this time, and back before, the preferred method of keeping pork was to brine soak it. Place it in a very strong salt solution, strong enough to bear an egg, as the saying goes. Vinegar solutions for short keeping, but strong brines with a little saltpeter added for good measure for long keeping. Somewhere in the 18th century, it became a much more common practice to dry salt cuts and then hang and smoke them in the colonies. Smoking meats in chimneys was definitely a thing in England as chimney technology was getting going. But for the most part, the common people with chimneys in England were in cities, so not keeping and slaughtering pigs. But in the colonies, lots of people had these new chimneys in their new homes. And even more so, they had larger plots of land so they could actually build smoke houses. Weird chimney setups not needed. So the dry salting techniques associated with the good hams, Westphalian, and yes, the Spanish hams, but we still aren't talking to the Spanish, became much more common on the colonial hams and colonial bacon. So seriously, the next thing we know, every tavern and village ordinary worth their salt was offering meals of cider and eggs and bacon, or later coffee and eggs and bacon. As a new shelf-stable food made locally, the salted smoked hams and bacons were a popular fast food of the day. They would keep in the smokehouse and in a cold stone pantry for much longer than lots of beef or fowl and obviously fish. And unlike potted meats, which required chopping and pounding and pottery and a fat cap to defend them from the air, hams and bacons were simply a lot less work. So with the development of the Virginia bacon and ham and the emerging egg industry of the day, the classic American breakfast is born, and we don't even have America yet. Oh, and that's not the only canonical pork food combination to come out of the 18th century. Can you guess what it is? Okay, I wouldn't be able to hear you even if you're guessing right. It's pork and applesauce. All those apple trees that got planted in the 17th century and continued to be planted, they didn't all end up as cider. I mean, many of the apples did. But not only was there apple pie and apple puddings, we also ended up with apple butter and apple sauce. And right there, in those early journals of colonial life and our Miss Amelia Simmons, it's decided that apple sauce is simply the best sauce for pork. Miss Simmons says that that's the only sauce she makes to go with pork cutlets and pork roasts. Now, in looking at all the pork recipes, it seems as if the 18th century people mostly didn't eat fresh pork. Nearly all the recipes seem to be for pickled pork and how to cook with pickled pork, how to make and smoke sausages and hams, how to make potted and collared pork. But the thing is, these are all the hard, complicated things to make. Most people didn't need a separate recipe to roast a fresh loin of pork. The recipe for venison or beef would work just fine. though the skin might turn out a bit nicer and crispier. And so few people were going to waste expensive extra paper on recipes no one really needed. So write down a recipe for stuffed pig ear ragu? Yes. But extensive instructions of chunks of pork in a stew? No. Which is why, in the recipe books in the early days, there simply aren't many recipes for fresh pork. Oh, and by the middle and the end of the century, beef is going to be the fancier meat. The middling and lower sorts of people were still eating lots of pork, but beef was growing as the fancier meat. But it was the fancier people who were buying the cookbooks and the middling and lower sorts who were still mostly cooking by word of mouth. So, not so many recipes of fresh pork. Pig farms were growing, whether closer to cities or in the forest estates that gathered their piggies from their spa in the woods to make superior hams. And all of these piggies on all of these farms allowed the wealthy to simply select just the parts that they wanted. The rest could be barreled up to send to the sugar islands and feed the labor that was sending sugar back to North America. While fish was certainly the number one export to feed enslaved workers, salt pork was definitely number two. And while plenty of sailors ate plenty of pork, over time it became common for more salt beef to go to the British Navy, thus continuing to build up the idea of the beef-eating Englishman and preferring it over any other foods. So, after pure piggy chaos in the 17th century, the 18th century starts to get the whole swine operation under control. We're still quite a ways from the cute pink piggies in children's literature. Right now they're spotted or have odd floppy ears or stripes. Some are still a bit tusky and frightening looking. Some will get out and wander the streets and scare the horses. But pigs at every house? That early colonial commonplace is fading away. There are now pig farmers and an emerging pork industry, toothbrushes and all. Next week, it's time to look at how the other half of the iconic American breakfast, the egg, was making its way onto colonial tables. Sure, they're still smaller than the modern egg, but they are not so rare as they were last century. I'll explain what's going on. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. I'm glad to have all these new listeners joining me. It's great to have you along. I'm sorry I'm behind on the blog again, but I'm still keeping notes and I'll get sources and photos up. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bio at @THOAFood. I'm also starting to put stuff up over at post.news, also at THOAFood. And all this information is in the show description.